I'm Marcus Wells. I'm the owner and founder of WellSecured IT. It's a cybersecurity firm. We specialize in identity security as the primary focus to cybersecurity posture, remediation, and everything that really comes under the umbrella of cybersecurity, right? Like everything. We don't look at it through the lens of red team versus blue team, purple team, yellow team, white team. It doesn't matter, right? It's all cybersecurity. And the primary function of cybersecurity is, of course, protecting the data. Data could mean anything. It could be intellectual property. It could be a napkin written idea that can, be the foundation of a new business. Anything is data. Any information is data. Anything that you share, anything that you think, anything that you read, it's all information. It's all data. So now that you have this like a brief understanding of who I am and what I'm about, what I'm doing here, I do want to just kind of go into a little bit about what we're going to cover before we jump directly into it. So the whole purpose of this is an introduction to the identity concierge service offering that my company provides. And part of that service offering is providing training to existing and incumbent professionals within the space. Part of that also includes career coaching, not just for those candidates, but also individuals in management. So just to kind of give you a small bit of context, what we have seen in this space, and not just specific to identity security, but all of IT and cybersecurity, is that language is the number one barrier for entry. Above everything else, it's language. One organization might call things one way, another organization might use the same nomenclature and use completely different definitions behind it. So our goal is to provide a unified piece of information that everyone can align to within the identity security space to remove ambiguity and increase understanding. The first thing that we want to really discuss as part of the agenda here is, what do we need to know about identity security? And the reason why we want to cover that is because many organizations are struggling with identity security right now. And the leadership within those organizations, they don't have the information to make these informed decisions. So we want to bring that information to them, right? And bring that information to them, we change the entire spectrum for how interviews are conducted. So that's the first thing. And we can get into that later on, but I just want to put a pin in that for now and give some room for that information to breathe. Additionally, we want to actually understand why we should care about identity security, and then also identify why other people care about identity security as well. So that the leadership, the management, the organizations, they care about it. They don't know that they care about it, right? And I'll go into that a little bit as well, right? There's a little bit of nuance there. So identity security in and of itself is not new. However, organizations haven't had a specific focus on it. So while they do care about the outcomes that identity security can bring, they don't quite understand the correlation between identity security and those outcomes. And that's why I kind of mentioned that here. We want to talk about identity security implementation, right? And also we want to talk about, the driving of that cybersecurity compliance piece, because that's a lot of the underpinning of why organizations will engage in these activities in the first place. With that being said, I just want to touch really quickly on the identity security implementation piece, because many organizations may have a different understanding of what implementation is. In my mind, implementation falls into two parts, and we can definitely go over this in more detail as well. The first part of implementation is bringing in a product into the environment and installing that product so that it can be used effectively, right? So you got SailPoint, you bring it in, you understand the resources you need from a technology and a people perspective, as well as a process perspective. You get it stood up, you make sure that you have the appropriate staff for what you're trying to accomplish to align the specific goals that you want to complete as an organization, right? And then the other side of that implementation is effectively getting the users within your organization, both from a technological staff as well as the end users or end customers within your organization, to actually use the product effectively, to use it as intended. So that's two sides of implementation. One is the standing up of the product, and the other is what I refer to as adoption rates. Before we move on, do I have any questions?
When I think of implementation, I think of when I've worked on ServiceNow. We had to, create rules and user groups and things like that. So that's when I think of that, I think of like platforms. I don't think of like the security aspect of it.
Right. And here's the thing: they are aligned. They coalesce. They can be two separate things, but they work hand in hand together, right? And so the type of implementation you're talking about speaks to the latter half of what I was discussing, which is the implementation side, where you already have a software or solution, quote unquote, stood up in the environment, and now you're getting people to actually utilize it in the way that you want them to utilize it. So you're absolutely correct in your vision of implementation. It's one very important piece of it.
I got a question too. So like, A lot at work, you know what I do? I do a lot of Linux provisioning.
Hmm.
Say I want to create a new server, that can be implementation, right?
Absolutely.
Creating
Absolutely.
the database, like say I want to create a virtual machine or AD machine, that's implementation itself, right?
Yes.
I can implement a workflow. So like, you know, ServiceNow, I say that's a workflow.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's a way to track the tickets. That's the way to, you know, track problems.
I listen. I love, and that's why I love ServiceNow. I especially, I'm sorry, but I did an externship. It was fun. It didn't go how I wanted it, but it was fun. And that was one of my favorite parts that we did was the workflow and just how to create things to like, okay, like say for instance, you created a catalog item and you would go through the flow of okay, this person selected it, they ordered this item, and this is what's going to happen after, like the flow of the steps. Like, you know, when you order something online
Hmm.
and you're like, okay, I clicked on this thing, I looked at it, see how much it is, I'm choosing this, and basically the flow was like the behind the scenes of like what's going to happen once you the consumer clicks on it. And that part, I love that part.
Oh, and we're gonna get into that in future discussions as well. But I'm glad that you both are pointing that out. So when I think of workflow, when I think of implementation, just to kind of keep it simple, the way I think about it is
Mm-hmm.
I am introducing a new way of interacting,
Okay.
right? Whether that
Mm-hmm.
be a computer system interacting with another computer system, that could be like a piece of hardware interacting with a new software or software interacting with new software, anything like that, right? Any configuration like that. Or it could be that I'm introducing a new way to interact to a person. That's really the only two ways that it's going to play out, right? It's going to be between a computer and a computer, or a system and a system, or a
Mm-hmm.
person and a system, right? It could be a person and a person too. So there's a different little like configurations there, but effectively what we're doing is we're introducing a new way to interact with a thing. It could be an established thing, it could be a new thing, but we're still
Mm-hmm.
introducing a new process. That is at the heart of what implementation is. So I'm glad you guys are thinking about this in that way. Yeah, that's amazing. All right, so going through this here, just kind of jumping directly into it, we're going to cover the understanding of identity security. So if you notice, I'm using very specific language. I'm not speaking about this through the lens of IAM, which is somewhat normalized within a space. We're taking a bit more of a broader scope here. And so when we think
Okay.
about identity security, we want to think about it in that wider scope of range, right? So, why should we care about identity security? The importance of identity security in that digital age. And of course, identity security is the foundation of cybersecurity. These are all really important things. So when we think about like why we should care about identity security, primarily the reason why is because we're talking about at its core people, right? The same way that we manage people or people are managed within an environment and a business, the core function of management is oversight, it's governance, is to provide some level of visibility beyond what a person working in a role as an individual contributor is normally able to see or interact with. So you can think about it like, we're going on a trek, right? I'm your Sherpa
Mm-hmm.
as the manager. I'm your Sherpa, right? When you go on a trek in an unexplored territory, you hire a guide, right? You're paying that guide to offer you a service to lead you through this territory and so that you can get from point A to point B and you can get there safely, right? And so that's really what a manager's role is effectively, right? So when we
Mm-hmm.
think about it through the lens of identity security, the identity security teams within these organizations is oftentimes operating in a similar way. We understand what comes beyond kind of what both of you were saying, right? What comes
Mm-hmm.
beyond that next step of I clicked on something, I interacted with something, and now this thing is happening as a result. And we want to make sure that that thing that happens as a result is always a positive thing and not a negative thing that can lead to risk, a breach, or any other type of unexpected security incident within the organization. And so, that leads into kind of like the bigger picture of what identity security is. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go along. But there are four pillars to this, and I'll say that for now, and I'll kind of move on. So, of course, we want to look at the importance of identity security in digital age, and we've already kind of covered it, right? The digital age within these environments is what we're living in right now. And it's quite unexpected. There's a lot of just uncharted territory just due to the nature of the way that technology changes. So we have to be always ahead of the cutting edge and understand what's happening in the space, what the objectives are, and constantly being able to align our activities so that we can create those processes and workflows, right, to guide the implementation to see the objectives be completed for the business, if that makes any sense. And then so the final part of this, of course, is, the identity security is the foundation of cybersecurity, and I always tell people you cannot have cybersecurity without identities. Three cores of the business, right? The three cores of any business is going to be people, process, and technology. And so the moment you introduce people, you introduce the identity of those people. The process, of course, is how those things interact. The other piece is technology. The technology within an organization is also a form of identity. If you domain join a laptop onto a new environment, that laptop, before it even gets a user assigned to it, now has an identity. That's the reason why it's able to join onto the domain. As soon as a domain join, it gets an identity. It's identified as laptop number XYZ. It's being tracked within the system through this digital means. The system is able to understand where it's logging into by the IP address. It's able to read the MAC address. There's all types of this metadata, right? Or what we might call attributes, right? There's specific attributes to that identity that are assigned to that identity specifically to be identified, right? To be tracked. That's kind of the importance of identity security to cybersecurity. They're intertwined. They're one and the same. Without identity, you have no security. It's just that simple. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later as well. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, just in this previous slide, but I'll kind of go right into a little bit more detail. So we hear these terminologies quite often, right? Stop me if you've heard this one before. IAM, or Identity and Access Management, PAM, or Privileged Access Management, CIAM, or Customer Identity and Access Management, and Zero Trust. These are all things you're probably familiar with, right?
I just heard the terminology when we were having a discussion. I've never heard of the terminology before. I did not know that there was a separate form of cybersecurity outside of it, within it. I just knew the broad term cybersecurity. I did not know that identity and access management or all of this terminology was within that, and that was something, worth looking at.
Right. And Sage, I don't know if you were jumping in and saying something. I don't want to cut you off here either.
Oh yeah, I've heard of it, all of that.
Okay.
I've heard of all of that. But the customer identity and access management, I haven't worked with that. A lot of the work I've done is internal to the organization, but some certifications I took with Azure allows you to manage customer data. That's I feel like customer identity and access management, you'll see that in a higher role than an analyst. That's me personally. That's what I think.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. And so I'll touch on this really quickly here to kind of provide some additional context. So there's three different roles within identity security. So these are the pillars, right? These are the different types of identity security that an organization can currently engage in. The roles are separate. So the roles would align to each one of these levels of activity, right? All of these levels of activity are equal in their existence, right? So these activities are all equal. So are the roles. The difference being is that a lot of times organizations will look at it through the lens of a hierarchy. So I'll kind of explain a little bit, right? So if we're thinking about it through that specific lens, there is an analyst role, there is an engineering role, and then there is an architect level role. Those are the three key roles. And those are roles aligned to the operations phase, the build phase, and the plan phase respectively, right? So operations, that's an analyst. Engineering, that's the build phase. Planning, that's the architect phase. They handle planning and strategy, right? So how does that relate to this? Within an organization, every organization should start off with, before doing anything else, identity and access management. Before you can offer products and services to a company or to a customer outside of your business, you first have to understand the identities within your business. I think that's fair. And so that's why we want to focus on IAM first. And so it's part of that workforce management of identities. If you are dealing with customer-centric data, then after you stand up IAM, you may want to also consider SIAM, right? So for instance, we all have bank accounts. I'm sure of it. When you go to your bank's website, you log in with a username and password, right? That at its core is SIAM. You are not an employee with that bank. However, you have a username and password with that bank that allows you to manage your information and your data exclusively. When you log in, you're not able to see anyone else's data. You're not able to interact with anyone else's records, only your own. And that is the function of SIAM. It does the same thing that IAM does for the workforce, but it does it for people who are not part of your organization as employees.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So with SIAM, right? Say I'm working with a third-party vendor that has external identities. Would that fall under SIAM, or would that still fall under identity and access management?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer can be both, right?
Okay.
So it really depends on the configuration of that interaction. So for instance, let's say you use my company as an example. WellSecured IT says I need to engage with outside third parties to do X number of work. If I interact with that third party and say I need contractors to come and work for my organization, then those contractors that will come and work for my organization will be covered under IAM because they're now part of our workforce. They're not full-time employees, but on a digital spectrum, they're treated as such, right? On the opposite end, the actual company that's providing us the service, that organization, their leadership, I don't want them to have the same level of access as the consultants that they're staffing us with. I still want them to be able to interact with some data that allows them to be able to provide reporting, metrics, or communications to us about those contractors. And so I would have some sort of additional system that allows that third-party organization to log in, and that wouldn't be inclusive of SIAM, if that makes any sense.
That makes plenty of sense. Because
Awesome.
I had to deal with that before, like external identities, but I've never had to, manage customer identity, not yet.
When you have external identities, and this is one of the beauties of say even like Azure as an example, right? You can invite people from outside of your organization as contractors or consultants, or just temp workers or whatever the case may be, into your organization temporarily. So you're provisioning them with those accounts, but the types of accounts they are not like they're not permanent accounts within your environment. They're actually specifically external accounts that you're invited in under the framework of they're going to be here for a set period of time. So that in that particular aspect, it almost blends much of IAM and SIAM together, right? It's that connective tissue that links those two pieces together, right? So yeah, that's an excellent use case you brought up there. That's perfect. And of course, zero trust, which the simplest way I can explain zero trust is this. Typically in IT and cybersecurity, we have had an approach of trust, then verify. You log into a system, you gain access to the network. I'm going to trust that you're doing the right thing because you wouldn't be able to log in without the appropriate credentials. So because I'm trusting you, I'm going to verify you after you've already logged in, after you've already gained access to the account, after you've already been able to interact with some level of data, whether it be just being able to read it or anything else, right? The problem is when an outside threat actor gains access, they're not going through the proper channels. Therefore, that trust but verify model is ineffective at protecting your organization. Zero trust says, very simply, verify, then trust. I'm going to make sure you are who you say you are. And then after I ensure that you are who you say you are, then I'm going to let you in. And even then, after I've let you in, you only have access to this very small piece, right? If you want access to anything else, you got to show me your credentials again. I've got to validate them. I've got to verify them again. And once I'm confident that you are who you still say you are, because I'm checking all of these things, I might be checking your IP address. I might be checking, what computer you're logged into, right? I might be checking the MAC address. I might be checking something like, the FCC ID if I have access to it. I might be checking of course, your username and password. Of course, if you use any kind of biometrics, I want to check that. Like anything that I have access to check, I'm going to check it. And the more things I have to check, the higher my confidence is that you are, in fact, who you say you are. Make sense?
Right.
Basically, like the more tools that I use to verify you, the more confident I am to let you in, basically.
You can think about it that way, but I would challenge it and say it a little bit differently. So it's not necessarily about the tools as much as it is about the attributes.
You mean attributes as far as like groups and all of that
So
type of stuff?
so attributes can be groups. However, a username is an attribute. A password is an attribute. The location where you work from typically is an attribute. And so the location where you work from should align to your IP address because the IP address is oftentimes tied to a geographical location based off of your
Yep.
local internet service provider. So that would then become an attribute. And even within that attribute has an additional layer of an attribute, right?
Yes, sir.
So those are the kind of things I'm looking for. And obviously it's not a manual process, but the system should be configured to look for these things.
So like the attributes you're talking about, like all that basic ServiceNow information, like the name, the birth date, maybe the email, password. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the more attributes you have that are non-fungible, right? So
Okay.
non-repeatable, cannot be cloned. The more of those types of attributes you have, the higher the confidence is that this person is who they say they are, and the lower the potential risk. Like my phone, I have a Pixel 6, I have an in-screen fingerprint sensor. That is a form of biometric authentication. It's looking to see if my fingerprint matches the record of the fingerprint that was stored when that system was set up. And so if I'm able to validate it against something like that, then I have a higher level of confidence that the person trying to log into this phone is actually the person who's supposed to be logged into this phone. I try to make things as simple as possible. So that's kind of like, the way I approach it. So kind of moving on here, we kind of skipped past the other stuff because we've already covered it just through the conversation. So where we are right now is we're just kind of like going over that high level overview of zero trust. I've touched on it a little bit just in that previous slide. The key thing that I like to call out here is zero trust being just a buzzword, right? Many people think of zero trust as just that buzzword, but even as we just talked about, it's the idea that an organization should be verifying first, then trusting that these resources are actually appropriate to access the data. So it kind of goes back to the original thing that we mentioned, the first top of the call, where we said, in cybersecurity, the number one function is to protect the data, right? And so zero trust really comes down to a couple different things. You are not trusting things inherently. You're verifying and validating first. Then you're saying, okay, I can trust you just in this one little area. You've been trusted because I've verified and validated your credentials. So you can come in and you can sit in the lobby and only the lobby, right? If we think about it kind of like a hotel, you can't go to the fitness room. You can't go to the pool room. You can't go to floors 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or any of the other floors, right? You can't go to any rooms. You can't access any of the other features of this facility. You can only come into the lobby because I've only verified you and validated you to gain this much access. And so by virtue of that, what we also get to talk about is something very important to zero trust, which is called micro-segmentation. It's the difference between saying having a hotel where, each one of those services is part of a different room, right? You have a fitness room, you have a pool room, that's an entire room with a pool in it, or maybe it's outside. It has its own specific segmented space. You have the actual lodgings where people can, get into their specific rooms in the building on each floor. So each floor is separate. Each room on each floor is separate. Each room on each floor has its individual bathrooms. Like you see that segmentation that kind of exists even within that structure. That's the same thing we want to mimic when we do zero trust within an organization. Every area of the organization should have its own segment around it. So that means every application has its own separate segment. Everywhere you can traverse on the network has its own separate segment. Every server has its own segment. Every user device is segmented. Every folder that holds data is segmented, right? And if you want to access each one of those things, then you have to prove that you both are who you say you are and have the level of access that is appropriate that would allow you to have that access. So we kind of go into why you want to never trust and always verify, right? And how that's a crucial concept in today's cybersecurity world. So we kind of already covered much of this. It's the idea that if an organization is breached, the very first thing that I'm going to do if I'm a cyber threat actor, I find a weakness in your website. I find some sort of vulnerability in the application you're using, right? I take that vulnerability and I exploit it. right? I find some way into your organization. So now that I'm in, what do I do, right? I found a way inside, but what can I do? Well, I need to assume the identity of someone or something that has access. So give you an example, the Move It vulnerability that's kind of going crazy right now, right? The individuals who were part of that vulnerability exploit, what they did was they ran what's called a SQL injection. And this part is really not super important. The important part is SQL is a database and it held information about usernames and passwords. They were able to send information into that database and have that database that would effectively trick the database into responding back to them and giving them information about valid usernames and valid password combinations. So once again, when I find a vulnerability, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to assume an identity. And that's exactly what they did. They were able to enumerate that data and assume an identity, right? Now, of course, they're assuming an identity of someone who works at an organization, and the systems that are in place within that organization, they're not checking to see, hey, this person is logging in from an IP address that we have never seen before. We should not actually give this person access. We shouldn't let this person in. And that's what Zero Trust is doing, will do when configured properly and implemented in an organization. It will look at those things and say, like, this is suspicious activity. This isn't normal. This shouldn't be happening. We're not going to give this person access until we can first have someone reach out to this person and verify that they are in fact the individual who's logging in here, and that we can validate that their IP address points back to the geographical location that they're actually accessing this resource from, right? I hope that makes sense.
I know you talked about when you sign up on a website, when you do that, they ask you to verify like your email or something like that. But I know with most, they'll allow you to kind of like explore the website, and then it'll ask you to send the verification again. You can see like in your account section, it'll have your email, it'll say verify this email. It's rare. I don't recall, I can't really remember sites where I had to verify my information before I got full access. I'm typically usually like, I have like some type of full access, which for me, I verify my email right away anyway, because I'm just like, I don't know if it's gonna tell me like, oh, you can't go any further past this point. And then I think about, like you said, like with the hotel, like you don't get access to that hotel room until you verify who you are. You pretty much in your check-in, and they give you a key that they program to that room.
Right.
And then you have that access.
Right.
So I never thought to think of all those things in the aspect of security.
I got a quick question. So Zero Trust, for all the contracts that I've did, I feel like Zero Trust is different for each organization.
It can be. It shouldn't be.
So.
It can be. It shouldn't be.
I have some jobs that would allow me to work remotely out the country. And then I have some jobs that strictly prohibit that.
Right.
That's just my honest opinion. Like, I feel like Zero Trust is different in each organization. That's just me.
So when implemented, it will take on the same meaning. The context can change. If I have an organization and I say, like, I want everyone in my organization to be working from home, right? Like from their actual home where their physical address is. I don't want you working from anywhere else except for your home office, right? Then I can still have Zero Trust under the definition of what we described. And when I see someone logging in from like a coffee shop because the IP address comes back different and it points to a different physical location, maybe like across town somewhere, then those systems would say, we're not going to let you in. Not going to do it. Right. It's just the enforcement of those policies. Right. So say, for instance, we change our policy and we say, hey, look, you can work from anywhere you want. You can work from Prague if you want. You can work from the sandy beaches of, Costa Rica if you want. Right. Like, we don't care as long as you get your work done. We can still implement Zero Trust because your device may be connecting to a different IP address. However, we would be looking for different types of attributes to validate and verify that you are who you say you are.
Which is probably going to be like what, 2FA or whatever.
It can be 2FA. What I would recommend doing in situations like that would be not just 2FA, because 2FA really speaks to a very specific type of multi-factor authentication. It's typically email-based, SMS text-based, or phone call-based. I would actually really encourage organizations to use MFA from more than just the 2FA standpoint,
2FA,
right? So like using push notifications, right? Using some sort of biometrics on a separate device that requires the input of a specific code, for example, right? There are different ways to do it, but the general concept, you are absolutely spot on. And even in that situation, one of the ways that my organization could prepare for that, if I was going to do something like that and say, hey, anyone can work anywhere they want, doesn't matter where in the world they are. The only thing that we would require is let us know beforehand that you are going to be working out of the country or working somewhere other than your normal place of work or residence, like your normal state of residence, for example. Yep. As long as we know that ahead of time, then when those things occur, we will be suspicious because we're not trusting anything inherently. However, we'll have been able to anticipate it. We're still going to verify, right? But we will be at a lower risk of thinking something has gone wrong and there's a security incident. And so we'll be able to take the necessary safety precautions in those situations. It's really all about just knowing and being prepared. And so many of these things, before I move on to the next slide, these are all modules that we have created like within WellSecured IT to cover in greater detail. I'm just giving you a top level kind of understanding of it right now, just so you can understand what all is identity security. So kind of revisiting this back, identity security is those 4 pillars. It is inclusive of IAM, identity and access management, PAM or privileged access management, SIAM or customer identity and access management, which in a lot of ways is a lot like IAM, with the focus being on external customers to your business, but the same core functions exist. There are just some additional nuances to kind of be aware of. And then finally, zero trust. So those are the 4 pillars of identity security. So going on through this, right, we discussed in the top of the conversation, the implementing of these security measures with an identity, right? And so we covered like what implementing actually means and what definitions it can take on within an organization. So I'll just do a quick recap. There's 2 sides to that coin. There's the implementation from standing up a software within an organization. So that's the technology piece. And then there's the piece of the people part of it and the process piece of it. So there's people, process, technologies, all the 3 signs of an effective business being run. So when we talk about implementation, we want to focus specifically on what is the technology and how is it being stood up. That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is how do we get our users to actually use this technology that now we've invested in. Right. And so that is complete holistic implementation, the people piece and the technology piece. You can kind of see here the diamond model. I've been talking about it quite a bit in this call. That people piece, the process piece, technology piece, they're essential for running a business. You'll continue to hear me talk about it throughout just these conversations, these modules. The importance of Active Directory or AD to your winning identity strategy. So Active Directory is one of the key databases. It is the key database in almost every organization that stores the data around an identity, not just a human identity, but all identities, right? So if you have human identities and you have non-human identities, and both of those informations are being stored in Active Directory, it stores the information about the identity itself, so the individual and that individual's attributes, from a person perspective, right? So this person works in the office or this person works from home. They will live in this state. This is their address. This is their phone number. You know, that type of information. It kind of looks like a contact card. If you've ever used Active Directory, you probably noticed that in many ways. And it also stores the username and password, of course, right, for the domain in which that person will be logging into. And the same thing kind of goes for the non-human identities within an environment. You're cataloging within Active Directory. This is the computer. This is the laptop. This is the thin client. This is the tablet, or whatever the case may be. As long as those devices are domain joined, they're going to be available or visible in Active Directory. And in some cases, where you have like phones and tablets, they are not going to be domain joined in the same way. There's going to be another application that is being used to manage those devices, but the application that is used to manage those devices will now have an identity in your Active Directory database. So by virtue, everything that application is inclusive of and manages, so that those mobile devices and tablets also is included as those identities within that AD database by proxy. And so, as part of this implementation, of course, we want to talk about the effective management of access, right? We want to make sure that the organizations that we're working with and aligned with have good policies, procedures, and, as we mentioned before, workflows in place to be able to manage that access in a way that ensures a high level of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when we talk about integrity, we're talking about the integrity of the data. We want to make sure that we're getting clean data, data that can be relied upon to be trustworthy and good information based off what we have pre-documented in our system. And then, of course, we want to cover some of those common implementation pitfalls that can come along with trying to implement new technologies, processes within the environment, and getting the people to adopt these things, right? So these are all things that we kind of cover as each part of those modules, as each 4 modules that we have after this. So we have one for IAM, PAM, SIAM, and Zero Trust, and we talk about the effective management within each side of that, as well as the common pitfalls that organizations should be aware of. And the reason why I'm telling individuals like yourself is because now you can go into these organizations and start having those conversations with them from a very informed and strategic standpoint, combined with the information that you already have with you today. Once again, kind of going over the understanding of Active Directory, right? The definition and overview of Active Directory, which we've already covered, it's a database, right? It stores that information relative to the users and accounts within your environment, and it's able to take that information as in many cases, the source of truth for identities within your environment, right? Understanding that role of identity security as it relates to Active Directory is essential. And I'm pretty sure it's pretty obvious at this point, right? If identity security is the activity of securing identities and the data that can access, then Active Directory is going to be a vital piece of that equation, because Active Directory allows an individual or an organization to then say, hey, I created an account for Marcus Wells within our system. And after creating the account, I'm now going to provision Marcus Wells with this level of access. So by giving Marcus this level of access, he is able to interact with these systems, these applications, these folders, and this data, right? It is the crux of that access management, portion of what we're doing within identity security. And then, of course, we've actually covered many of the basic components and functionalities of Active Directory by virtue of that, which is just that the ability to create objects, whether it be people-based objects or computer-based objects, or whether what I say is non-people-based objects, with the addition of group objects within Active Directory. With the combination of all of those 3 things, we can begin to create a holistic approach to managing the access to the data that we're trying to protect, because we can't just keep the data all locked up and no one has access to it. It'll be a very secure environment. However, it won't be a business for very long. People still need to access the data, right? Like, you still need to be able to access the data to be able to do your work. Much of the stuff is kind of just covered just by virtue of us having this conversation, right? So we talk about that user access management. This is a nomenclature that was often used by cybersecurity and information security professionals before IAM was really heavily adopted as a way to approach this from a different perspective. And it was often considered under the lens of like what they refer to as like the JML process, or the join, remove, reliever process. It focused specifically on getting users created so that they can work within an environment, making sure that those users had the appropriate level of access if their role changed in some way, shape, or form, or their activities changed within the organization, as well as leaving, or that leaver process, which is, hey, this person no longer works here for whatever reason, and we need to actually remove that access because they're no longer here, they're no longer needed, right? We're really covering that definition, or we're redefining what user access management is through the lens of identity security, right? We're looking at the difference between Active Directory hosted and application-specific user access controls. So, as we mentioned before, we're talking about controlling access through Active Directory. However, there are 2 different types of applications and access that can be given in an environment. There are applications that rely on Active Directory to manage their access, and there are many applications that do not rely on Active Directory to manage their access. Things like for example, SAP. SAP is in many cases an accounting software, and in some versions of SAP, the access cannot be controlled through Active Directory. You have to go into SAP directly and build users' accounts there in the application. And that's what we mean when we see application specific or application layer of user access controls, if that makes any sense.
What about like SailPoint CyberArk? That utilizes Active Directory, right?
Yes, in a very unique way.
Okay.
Right. So when you stand up SailPoint or any of these other identity security tools, they do get Active Directory objects created for them within the environment. So that way you can have users who are responsible for administrating the platform. On the other hand, you're not going to create a grouping of users within the application itself to be able to have access to the data and resources that, say, SailPoint would control. So once I stand up, like kind of walking through this just super high level, once I get SailPoint implemented in my organization from a technical perspective, I'm going to have as part of that groups in Active Directory that will be responsible for managing the application itself, or administrating the application itself of SailPoint.
Okay.
Right. And so once I assign a owner of the SailPoint application, I'll put that in the Active Directory object and say, this is the owner. I'll add individuals who will be responsible for administering that platform into that responsible Active Directory group that manages SailPoint as an application.
Okay.
And then those individuals will go into SailPoint, and by virtue of them having the access to administrating it, they will then begin to implement those users or bring those users in across the organization, across different applications into the SailPoint platform. But it's leveraging the data that exists in your Active Directory environment currently to pull that data.
So is it replicating those users, like, or are they manually going into SailPoint and creating the user?
It is a form of replication.
Okay.
Right. So it's reading the information from your Active Directory environment. It's saying, okay, these are the users that you're gonna implement into this platform. And on the other side, once again, so you have the users or the identities, we'll say, right, and then you have the application. So of course, you need both pieces into SailPoint in order to make it function correctly. You need the identities to be in SailPoint, but you also need the applications to also be in SailPoint. When you have the combination of those two things, then SailPoint can say, okay, even if you have an application like SAP, where its access is normally not managed through Active Directory, SailPoint says, don't worry about it. I got you. I have the ability to manage the access because of this specific integration. And that actually also covers like the basics of designing user control systems as well, right? So, and then kind of going a little bit into that. So when we talk about like these user control systems or access control systems, we're talking about those models that maybe we use within organizations. So you may have heard things like RBAC, PBAC, ABAC, and they mean different things. The AC part of those designations is literally stands for access control.
Access control, yep.
Right. And so when you have RBAC, it's role-based access control. That means that I'm looking at the organization, I see what kind of teams I have in the organization. Each team is responsible for a different activity, right? And each team has specific roles on that team. So like kind of like we mentioned before, you have within identity security, you have a plan team member, you have a build team member, and you have a operational team member. And those team members align specifically as a one-to-one ratio to a role. So kind of going back from top to bottom, you have a architect level role, that's the planning and strategy. You have the engineer level role, which is the building, right? And then you have the analyst level role, which is the operation. So now we can take the responsibilities and we can align them perfectly to a role. And then we can use that role to say, okay, well, if this role is responsible for X, then this role would require Y level of access to Z applications and data and resources. And then of course you get into like more complex aspects of access control, like attribute-based access, which we talked about quite a bit. So the more attributes that you're collecting within your environment, the more fine grain that you can tune it. And you can have RBAC and ABAC in the same organization. In fact, in many cases, you may need to. You also have like PBAC, which is policy-based access control. So that's when you have all those other things, everything starts with role-based access, right? So then once you have role-based access, you can start to do some of the other things, but you can't do it without it. But policy-based access says, look, we have a policy that dictates when, where, why, and how this information can be used and under what constraints it cannot be used. And so by creating those policies and having a system to enforce those policies, then you can actually start to apply those policies to specific users, groups, and other non-human identities. And we're actually close to the end here. So, we want to talk about compliance within identity. So everything that we just talked about, right? Like everything we just mapped out, there's a reason for it. The reason is that the business has to operate in a very specific way for legal reasons, for security reasons. And those things are kind of under the umbrella of compliance. So, we definitely want to look at some of those popular cybersecurity frameworks, things like NIST, like the 800 series or the 600 series. You may have things like ISO 27000, which is a framework that's really used a lot in the UK and Britain, in that European country. That is one of the cybersecurity frameworks that they will often use. And so when you have an organization in the States who wants to align to an ISO 27000 risk framework or a cybersecurity framework, many times it's because that organization either is doing business in those countries or wants to do business in those countries, or perhaps they're not doing business directly in those countries, but one of their clients that they deal with is ingesting data that now that business, like say for instance, my business would then have to be responsible for, because I'm accessing that data as well. And so I have to be compliant to that, lest I want to face fines and potentially not be able to do business. So that's just a high level of where these things even come from. You can think of those frameworks as like these giant checklists. It's telling you exactly what needs to be in place and how it needs to be in place, like what it can look like, how what those performance factors or success factors within implementing those particular security controls. And it will be up to, us as the individuals within that business to then define, okay, these are the requirements. Here's how we're going to satisfy those requirements. Here are the people who are going to be responsible for managing those things. Here are the processes that we have to be able to meet those requirements and to stay compliant with them. And here are the technologies that we're going to utilize to enforce those controls. So we kind of covered, the cybersecurity frameworks. We cover how those frameworks can guide identity security policies and procedures. And right now, there aren't any specific NIST frameworks that align explicitly to identity security. However, NIST, which is a US-based government agency that defines those standards, is working on a framework in cybersecurity for identity security. It's an interesting thing to see it only happen now, but it's definitely overdue, and I'm happy to see that it is moving forward. And of course, we want to look at the importance of aligning to identity security within organizational policies, right? So the organization is going to have policies unto itself outside of the parameters of identity security. So when we're doing this work, the organization says like, hey, this is the type of activity that we engage in. This is the way we do that thing. And here's how our users are expected to behave as part of that. And so, identity security in a lot of ways sets the tone for how those things can happen or will happen within the organization. Now, I will add one additional point to this. Identity security is a very unique activity set within cybersecurity. It's very different in how organizations have approached cybersecurity practice in the past. So where in many other cases, you may have a security team that is solely responsible for doing X activity. Identity security is very different because it requires the entire organization, both IT, cyber, and operations outside of IT and cyber, to be a part of these initiatives. It is a complete overhaul of technological transformation as well as philosophy transformation. And that's a very important thing to kind of understand when engaging in these activities. It is so much bigger than just, oh, here's an IAM team. You guys are going to be responsible for all the things, and you're going to make all this stuff happen so that we can be secure. It can't work that way. You need the organization to have buy-in. You need to have executive sponsorship. You need to have that executive leadership that has that buy-in. And you also need to have the communication strategy so that way the users within the organization can understand that they have a responsibility here too. And I'll say it like this way, it's kind of like if you are riding with a friend, somebody, you consider them a friend, and you're riding with them in their car. They get pulled over and the police say, hey, look, something suspicious going on here. So they decide they run a search in the vehicle. When they search the vehicle, they're able to discover that there is some contraband in the car, illegal contraband. Typically in a situation like that, the police are taking everyone in the vehicle to jail. The same thing goes here, right? Just because someone didn't know doesn't mean they're not responsible or they're not being held responsible. And under the same types of parameters, whether it be right, wrong, or indifferent, The organization has to have buy-in across the spectrum. Every single person in that organization has to be responsible, because when someone clicks on an email from accounting and it ends up being some sort of malware or some sort of like keylogger or some sort of other malicious actor that has gained access to the environment due to that person's activity, it's not just them that has made a mistake. The mistake was made well before them. Then the questions start getting asked of what kind of training was provided? What systems were in place to prevent this from even getting this far? How are we protecting the data once something like this does happen? You know what I mean? So it's so much more than just, oh, the IAM team is going to handle it. Nope, not at all. It's got to be a group effort. Everybody in the organization has to be on board, and everyone has to take a piece of that pie. This is in. That's it, right? I want to provide some opportunity to field some questions, provide some additional context where I can. What do you think about what we've covered? Like, what are your thoughts?
To be honest, it was very informative because, like I told you, I've been trying to find information on the subject at hand, but I was looking for a particular demographic to get this information from. Nothing against anyone else, but I think for me it's more receptive. Like I said, it was very informative. Bits and pieces I kind of already knew, like you said I would. And then there were parts where I didn't. And also with you going over it, I was trying, that's why I had myself muted. I was trying so hard not to just like cut you off and just start going on a rant because I'm just like, oh, and then my mind is just like I told you, my mind goes a million miles a minute, and I'm just like, okay, you just let them go through it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you.
Yeah, I think you're good money, man. I think like somebody that's entry level to IAM, this would be a great course for them. My honest opinion, I would charge the hell out of somebody for this information. That's just me.
Awesome. Did you feel like there was anything that we covered that was new information to you?
I wouldn't say it was completely new, but it's definitely refreshing, I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
I would like to know more about RBAC, all of those RBAC type of things, rollbacks, access control, and all the rest of them. I would want to learn that, and skills as far as implementation. I want to concur like engineer skills.
Right.
I'm not trying to be an analyst all my life. We can try to get something more like engineer based, a little bit more advanced for people that's already IAM. That would definitely help me out.
Absolutely. And so I'll kind of mention this to you. So this is really just exactly what it is, right? It's just the introduction to identity security. The other modules that I've created go more in depth about it. And then the other thing I will say is that these courses are designed to create identity security leadership, not just analysts, not just engineers, not just architects. I'm talking about like leaders.
I'm all for it. I love it. I think if I had this when I first started, it probably made the process go by a little quicker. But shoot, we got it now.
That's it, man. That's it. Baba, did you have any thoughts? Anything you maybe want to share?
Yeah, so like, cause I'm really like when it comes to like cybersecurity and like IT, like I'm a very like beginner level, like because I've only been like going to college for a little bit, and just like some of my friends have been like kind of helping me try to get into it. So I don't really have as much knowledge. So this definitely like was really informative, and I did kind of also understood some stuff that was more like to cybersecurity than I thought after I learned about this. So that was really good because it wasn't as straightforward as I kind of like had in my mind and envisioned, especially like with all the way like the companies work and all the policies and all that stuff too. So this was really good.
Yeah. And I'm really happy that you mentioned that too, because, a lot of times when people come into cybersecurity, it doesn't matter how you come in, doesn't matter if you have a college degree, doesn't matter if you've searched, doesn't matter if you have none of it, right? Many people come in, they think about it the same way we've been trained to think about IT. And it's not like that at all. Not even IT is like that at all, right? It's not like, oh, come in, work on a computer, and that's it. This is related to the business. We have to know how the business functions. We have to know how businesses function in order to execute these kinds of changes. Because really what we're doing is these organizations are asking us to come in and fundamentally, foundationally change how their business functions. Like if you say, hey, look, we were talking about this a little bit earlier when it came to like workflows, right? When you click on this button, this is the response that you will get from that button. When you click on this button that looks like a folder, when you click on it, what's going to happen is it's going to open up and it's going to show you all the contents of that folder, right? That's what we know. We've been doing that for our entire lives, and we know that that's the response. What IAM is doing, what identity security is doing, is saying, hey, look, when you click on this folder icon, you're going to get a prompt. And that prompt is going to say, hey, what's the username and password? Okay, thanks for putting that information in. Now we're going to send you a code to an application that you've installed on your devices. And in order for you to get into that application, you have to authenticate again using a different code. So we're fundamentally changing how people interact with things. And we all know, like, we're human. We're built on patterns ingrained in how we normally do things. So, you know, you introduce something like that to the equation, it's like some people will be a little standoffish, like, what the hell's going on here? This is unfamiliar to me. I don't like this. This is change. This is making my life more difficult. I'm having to think about things I didn't have to think about before, and I just want to do my job. And that's kind of what we talk about when we say, like, it's a philosophical change to this whole approach as well. It's so much bigger than just, you know, oh, these products and services. So, you know, I want to say thank you for joining. You know, I definitely appreciate your participation. It means a lot to me to get this feedback. I definitely wanted to let you know that you can find me, of course, on LinkedIn. You know, you can search my company, WellSecured IT. You can find our website at wellsecuredit.com, and you can even email for additional information at info@wellsecuredit.com.